It was Halloween night, 2017, in rural Carbon County, Pennsylvania. The kind of town where kids grow up fast but never really leave, where October meant crisp air, leaf piles, and the one thing teenagers actually looked forward to, the haunted house just off Route 209. Locals called it Graybridge, but the seasonal attraction changed names every year. That year, it was branded Fearland Asylum, a converted textile warehouse dressed up to mimic an old psychiatric hospital, complete with rusted gurneys, padded walls, and a signature finale, the Asylum Room. For years, it was the most talked-about scare in town. 17-year-old Caleb Rains had gone with 5 friends. Photos show him grinning in the parking lot, wearing a cheap lab coat someone handed him at the gate. He wasn't one for horror movies, but he liked the adrenaline, and more than that, he liked his friends. The group entered just after 8:45 p.m. Wristbands scanned, phones left behind in lockers per the haunted house rules. The attraction was known for being high intensity, and visitors were routinely separated in the dark for brief moments during the experience. It was part of the thrill. Staff later confirmed Caleb was seen entering each section of the house with his group: a clown maze, a morgue corridor, a strobe-lit staircase where you had to crawl under hanging limbs. Everything was tightly choreographed and designed to disorient. The last stop was the Asylum Room. According to everyone who was there that night, the room was chaos. Screaming actors in hospital gowns, flickering lights, fake blood. People ran through in pairs or trios. A final hallway led into a simulated padded cell with mirrored walls. The illusion was meant to make you feel trapped, but in the end, there was always a clear way out. Except this time, one person didn't make it through. Caleb's friends exited into the final blacklight tunnel around 9:20 p.m. They regrouped just before the gift shop, laughing, catching their breath, comparing scares. It took almost a full minute before someone said, "Where's Caleb?" They waited, joked, called his name, assuming he'd jumped out somewhere behind them. But after 5, then 10 minutes, the humor drained from their voices. They flagged down an employee. The girl at the front desk told them to check the bathrooms or the lot. Maybe he ran outside early. Maybe he was messing with them. But Caleb's car keys were still in his locker. So was his phone. So were the emergency contacts the haunted house required all minors to list before entering. By 9:50 p.m., the site manager had paused the attraction and started what they called a full sweep. Actors came out of character, lights went on, security walked the path in reverse, no sign of Caleb. A second sweep followed, then a third. Doors were unlocked, hallways checked. One emergency exit was stuck shut. Another led to a fenced area, still padlocked. Staff insisted he couldn't have. Slipped past the exit monitors. At 10:27 p.m., his friends called his parents. At 10:42, 911 was contacted. By 11:15 p.m., state police had arrived on site. They brought K9 units, flashlights, heat sensors. The surrounding woods were searched, the parking lot closed. Every remaining guest was questioned. Still no sign of him. His parents arrived sometime after midnight. His mother, Angela, later described the moment she saw the crowd forming outside the warehouse. "You think it's just a mix-up? A delay. Something dumb," she said. "You don't know the moment your son actually disappears. You only know the moment it stops being explainable." The next morning, police began collecting surveillance footage. The entire attraction had overhead cameras installed for safety and crowd control, though most of them were set to motion detection and many had blind spots by design to keep the illusion intact. One clip pulled from the corridor leading into the asylum room clearly showed Caleb entering the space with 2 of his friends. That was at 9:17 p.m. A second clip from the hallway exit showed the same 2 friends coming out alone. Caleb wasn't behind them. At first, authorities wondered if he'd exited through one of the emergency paths, but none of the panic bars had been triggered. They wondered if he'd hidden somewhere, maybe dared by friends or trying to prank the staff. But multiple walkthroughs found nothing. No trace, no movement, not even a piece of clothing left behind. By day 3, Every wall had been knocked on, every prop disassembled, every inch of the building inspected. A crawl space was found behind one of the walls, but it led nowhere. Another hallway ended in a sealed maintenance closet, still locked from the outside. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of injury, no sound recorded. Just a 17-year-old who walked into a room with two friends and never came out. The building was shut down for the remainder of the season. Caleb's face appeared on missing posters and news segments across 3 counties. But tips faded within weeks. The attraction rebranded under new owners the following year, quietly distancing itself from the investigation. Some people in town still believe Caleb never left the property. Others think he ran away. But those closest to him, his friends, his parents, insist he had no reason to vanish. He was happy. He had a job interview lined up the next week. He left behind his phone, his wallet, and his Halloween candy still sitting in the backseat of his car. And yet, somewhere between the padded cell and the mirrored exit, Caleb Raines was gone. No goodbyes, no sound, no trace, and it wouldn't be until 8 years later that anyone realized what had been hiding just a few feet away. The first few hours after Caleb vanished were tense, but oddly quiet. Authorities treated it like a high-priority but routine incident. An overdue teenager who'd likely wandered off in cheetah costume, possibly got lost in the nearby woods or was pulling some elaborate prank. There was no initial sense of danger, no urgency beyond what any local police department might bring to a missing person call. But by dawn, that changed. When the haunted house still hadn't located a single item belonging to Caleb, no jacket, no keys, no shoe, no phone, something shifted. By mid-morning, the search turned serious. State police cordoned off the property. The haunted attraction and the stretch of woods behind it were divided into tight search sectors. A creek bordered the eastern edge, dense timber to the north. Drones equipped with thermal imaging scanned overhead. Helicopters flew grid patterns. Search and rescue teams were brought in from 2 counties over. Cadaver dogs were deployed by afternoon. Volunteers showed up, local firemen, church groups, neighbors. The terrain wasn't difficult, but the underbrush was thick, and the trail system behind the haunted house was confusing. If Caleb had gotten disoriented, they believed they would have found something, a footprint, a thread of fabric, a heat signal. But nothing turned up, no scent trail, no sign of him ever stepping outside the structure. Dogs kept circling back to the same stretch near the asylum room. Handlers called it a false lead, maybe contaminated by heavy foot traffic. One K9 sat near the utility wall and refused to move. They re-ran the search 4 times. The results never changed. Inside, the building was combed again, this time by investigators trained in structural forensics. Every crawl space, ceiling hatch, prop room, and emergency passage was examined. Every fake wall was knocked on. The entire electrical system was shut down and rechecked for alternate power sources. No secret passageways were found, no hidden doors. Just a strange building with too many dark corners and too many ways to twist reality into confusion. Detectives began focusing on the timeline. How long was Caleb inside the asylum room before someone noticed he hadn't come out? The footage showed his friends emerging 4 minutes after they'd entered. That left a tiny window of time, maybe a minute and a half, during which Caleb either veered off or was separated. His group had gone in together, shoulder to shoulder. But the footage never captured him exiting. It simply stopped. The angle of the exit hallway camera had a blind spot where a wall jutted out to hold a rack of old straitjackets, a decorative touch. The footage showed 2 of his friends passing that rack and turning the corner into the final tunnel. Caleb never followed. His reflection never even appeared in the mirrors lining that corridor. There was no camera inside the asylum room itself, just the hallways before and after. Police asked the obvious question, could he have exited through an emergency door? It was possible in theory, but each one was fitted with an alarm and exterior locks. None had been tripped. None had opened. They were sealed from the inside and wired into the building's power grid. No lights flashed, no beeps registered, and again, there would have been tracks. If he left through any of those doors, where did he go? By the third day, investigators started pressing staff harder. Interviews were conducted again, this time with body cameras on and timeline charts in hand. Some employees had worked there for years, others had been hired just for the season. Several were local high schoolers. A few came from out of town. All of them insisted the same thing. Caleb went in, everyone exited. Nobody saw him stay behind. A few inconsistencies emerged. One actor initially said she remembered Caleb hiding behind the gurney as a joke, but later admitted she may have confused him with another kid in a white coat. Another swore she saw Caleb exit and slap his friend on the back. When police showed her the exit footage, she couldn't find herself in the crowd either. One of the managers admitted they'd disabled some of the smoke effects that night because of humidity, but that wouldn't have impacted visibility in the asylum room. Still, there was no forensic evidence of a crime. No blood, no weapon, no scream captured on audio. No external injuries to any props or structures. The padded cell had one light bulb shattered, but staff said it had been broken for days. Surveillance hard drives were reviewed in full. No footage had been deleted, no loops found. And yet, Caleb walked in and didn't come out. On day 4, detectives asked a question no one wanted to hear out loud. Was it possible someone had taken him? Could an employee or visitor have led Caleb off course, through a maintenance area or hidden space? The layout made it difficult. The asylum room had only one official entrance and one monitored exit. The emergency doors were too loud. The HVAC system was too narrow. But a human predator, someone who knew the blind spots, someone who had time, maybe. The idea was horrifying, but the alternatives were worse. If Caleb hadn't been taken, then he had to still be somewhere inside that building. And if he wasn't, then the only explanation was something no one wanted to write into a report, something that didn't make sense. A boy vanished in a crowded space with no one seeing it happen and no evidence left behind. The search expanded another 2 miles beyond the property. Drones swept again. A team was brought in to scan for underground storm drains or old septic systems. One detective asked to see the original construction permits. A forensic architect was consulted to analyze the warehouse's structural history. But by the end of the 7th day, there was still no trace, no sounds, no signals, no sign of life. And while the official investigation stalled, something about that building refused to let go of the feeling that Caleb had never left it at all. It was a week after Caleb vanished when the call came in. An off-duty EMT named Mark Dreisen had worked the haunted house on Halloween as a volunteer just for the night. He'd been posted inside the asylum room, helping to monitor safety near the padded cell exhibit. At the time, the job seemed simple. Stand in the shadows, make sure no one passed out, and let the actors do their thing. But something had been nagging at him since that night, something he almost dismissed entirely. He remembered leaning against the foam-padded wall of the cell between waves of guests and noticing a red smear just above the seam. It wasn't unusual. Fake blood was everywhere, but this stain had been tacky, still wet, and it had a slightly different color, more rust than syrup. He didn't report it at the time because, like everyone else, he assumed it was part of the design. Now, he wasn't so sure. Detectives responded quickly. The padded cell had already been swept, photographed, and logged. But when crime scene techs returned with luminol and fresh gloves, they found something they'd missed. Behind one of the foam panels, wedged between the insulation and the real wall, was a darker patch of dried material, not visible from the surface, just residue caught in the edge of the padding. The sample was collected and sent to the lab. 3 days later, the results came back. It was human blood, and it belonged to Caleb Rains. The finding changed everything. The case officially shifted from a missing persons file to a suspected criminal investigation. But the discovery raised more questions than answers. The blood was minimal, just enough for DNA. There was no sign of arterial spray, pooling, or spatter patterns. No indication of trauma or cleanup. No tissue, no fingernails, no torn fabric, nothing to suggest a violent scene. The amount was so small that prosecutors later admitted it wouldn't have met the threshold for probable cause in a warrant. But it was enough to confirm one thing. Caleb had bled. Inside the room. On that wall. Somehow. Investigators re-examined the layout of the asylum room. The padded walls were made from foam core boards, mounted with industrial adhesive. They weren't designed to be removed nightly, which made the blood's position confusing. Either it had soaked through, unlikely given the material, or it had been placed there before the padding was installed. A third option was considered, that one panel had been pried loose at some point, exposing the real wall underneath. If someone had done that, and if Caleb was bleeding, he could have pressed against it. But then what? Where did he go? They questioned every staff member again, focusing on access. Only a handful had keys to the interior storage closets. Even fewer had permission to tamper with the set design. No one admitted to altering the asylum room in any way. Some actors expressed disbelief. Others seemed nervous. A few simply said they didn't remember that part of the night. One of the investigators returned to the building alone the following morning and spent 2 hours knocking on every foam wall inside the asylum room. Most sounded hollow. One sounded different, slightly denser, less echo. They peeled back that panel with a crowbar. Behind it was nothing but concrete, no door, no opening. Just another seam in a building that didn't seem to want to give up its secrets. The working theory was grim. If Caleb had been injured, however slightly, and if someone had access to that room, it was possible they had isolated him somehow. Maybe used a hidden space, a trap door, something designed for storage or maintenance that was overlooked in early construction records. But again, no one could find it. There were no floor plans that accounted for extra square footage, no blueprints showing alternative passageways, no suspicious voids on ground-penetrating radar scans. Caleb had been there. He had bled. And then he vanished. The public, already on edge, reacted sharply to the news. Rumors exploded online. Forums dedicated to urban legends and haunted attractions latched onto the story. Some claimed the place was cursed. Others swore there were underground tunnels used during the Cold War. A few suggested human trafficking. One user posted a blurry photo from 5 years earlier, showing what they claimed was a sealed basement door near the boiler room. Police followed up on it. The photo was real, but the door was part of a fire suppression system long since decommissioned. Caleb's mother held a press conference. She thanked the EMT for coming forward. She asked for compassion. She begged anyone who might be withholding something, anything, to speak now. Her voice cracked when she said Caleb was the kind of kid who always looked out for others, who kept candy in his backpack for the younger kids at church, who once gave away his entire allowance to help a friend pay for a field trip. If someone hurt him, she said, please don't let him be left alone. But no new leads came in. What haunted investigators most wasn't just the blood. It was how little sense the whole thing made. Caleb hadn't screamed. He hadn't run. He hadn't left behind a trail. The building had cameras, exits, actors, lighting. It was supposed to be a controlled environment, a safe scare. And yet somehow, someone managed to either make him disappear or convince everyone around him that he never existed in that moment at all. There was no body, no witnesses, no confession, just a faint smear behind a foam wall and a timeline that refused to make room for anything else. By mid-November, just as the public began to settle into the idea that Caleb's case was stalled, something shifted. It didn't come from a forensic lab or a surveillance breakthrough. It came from memory. Specifically, from the recollections of several guests who had been inside the haunted house that night. Stories started circulating online and in police interviews. Not rumors. Exactly. But fragments. Snippets from people who didn't know each other, who had walked through the asylum room at different times. Each of them mentioned the same thing. An actor in a dirty, stained straitjacket. Too tall, too quiet, and not part of the show. One teenage girl who came forward claimed she saw the man just inside the padded cell. He wasn't moving like the other actors. He stood with his back to the group as they entered, breathing heavily, shoulders hunched. She thought it was part of the atmosphere. Everyone did. But as she passed by him, she swore she heard him whisper something, Not in character, not loud, but direct. She couldn't make out the words, but she remembered one thing. He was speaking to Caleb. Another visitor, an older man who had gone through earlier in the evening with his teenage son, said the same man had approached him near the mirrored corridor. He thought it was strange how close the actor got. Too close, he said, but the thing that stuck with him was the man's eyes. Not wild or manic, like most of the performers. Blank, almost dazed, like he wasn't pretending. A third account, logged 2 days later, described an unsettling moment during a brief power flicker that occurred around 9:15 p.m. The safety lights had kicked on, illuminating the room in pale white. Most of the actors broke character, some even laughed. But one didn't. A man in a stained jacket, tall, narrow face, just stood there, unmoving. The witness said the man kept staring at one of the guests. Again, they believed it was Caleb. And then, just as the lights came back, he slipped out of sight. When the lead detective heard the accounts, he pushed for a full staff audit. Management handed over shift rosters, ID photos, W-2s, costume logs. They were adamant. No such character was in the asylum room. Their version of the script didn't even include a straitjacket actor that year. The only characters officially present were 2 nurses, a doctor in blood-spattered scrubs, and a mental patient in chains. They all clocked in, signed out, and matched guest descriptions elsewhere in the attraction. No one fit the description of the silent man. No costume was unaccounted for. No freelance performers had been hired that night. The detective labeled it mass misperception. A trick of the mind, he said. Halloween, dim lights, suggestible conditions. He chalked it up to panic colliding with imagination. But Caleb's parents didn't accept that. And neither did one of the responding officers, who later told a colleague that something about those testimonies felt too consistent, too specific. One by one, the guests were re-interviewed. Not together, not prompted. They were shown different photo arrays of actors, both from that night and past seasons. None of them recognized anyone. But when asked to describe the man again, the words repeated like an echo. Tall, pale, long limbs, hollow voice, dirty canvas jacket, blank stare. Not theatrical, not exaggerated, just present. Investigators ran background checks on all staff, including janitors and part-time contractors. No red flags, no history of violence, no outstanding warrants. One former employee, who'd worked the haunted house 2 years earlier, said the description sounded vaguely familiar. He recalled a man who showed up late one season and claimed to be filling in for someone. He didn't say much, just kept to himself. Management said no one by that name had ever been on payroll. It didn't help that the haunted house had changed ownership twice in 5 years. Records were scattered, security protocols were loose, seasonal workers came and went, turnover was high, paperwork often incomplete. Nobody had reason to keep files on a guy who showed up in makeup and left by midnight, especially not if he blended in. Online speculation exploded. Some Reddit threads suggested the straitjacket man was a local drifter who slipped in unnoticed. Others theorized he had once worked there and returned unofficially, but none of the claims were ever verified. Police canvassed hospitals, shelters, and nearby motels. No one matching the description had been reported in the area. Caleb's parents began printing flyers again, this time not just with Caleb's face, but a composite sketch of the unknown man, built from guest descriptions. They stapled them on gas station poles, handed them out at fairs, sent them to regional news stations. The image was stark. Sunken eyes, thinning hair, mouth slightly ajar. Not a monster, just a man. The kind you pass on the street and forget 5 minutes later. The kind that doesn't seem dangerous until he doesn't blink when the lights come on. There was no footage of him, no time-stamped evidence, just eyewitness memories that refused to fade. Still, for Caleb's family, it was the first tangible sign of something intentional, something human, not a disappearance, not an accident. Someone inside that building may have interacted with their son and never told anyone. The flyers didn't bring leads, but they did something else. They reopened a question the investigation had tried to close. If someone had been hiding in plain sight inside the asylum room that night, then maybe Caleb hadn't disappeared into thin air. Maybe someone took him. By the time the next Halloween rolled around, the haunted house reopened under a different name, the Forgotten Ward. New theme, new owners, same building. The rebranding felt calculated, even defensive, but the message was clear. The show would go on. The padded cell was removed. The asylum room was replaced with a post-apocalyptic virus lab. No mention of Caleb appeared in the marketing, the signage, or the scripted tour. Just a silent pivot away from what had happened the year before. For some, the change worked. Teenagers returned, drawn by curiosity or the thrill of the place's infamy. Others stayed away, unsettled, by the idea of celebrating Halloween in a space where a boy had disappeared. But the haunted house survived. It kept running. The line grew long again, and slowly, year by year, what had once felt like a living emergency started to settle into something else, something colder, a local myth. Caleb's story never quite vanished, but it stopped leading the evening news. The headlines faded. Tips slowed. The reward went unclaimed. Online, the case took on a life of its own. Forums dedicated to urban disappearances, haunted attractions, and unsolved mysteries latched onto the story. Some speculated about hidden tunnels under the property. Others said there had been a second actor, never identified, who left the state right after the disappearance. A few insisted the boy had staged it himself, escaping to start a new life, but most leaned toward something darker, some kind of copycat killer, a man hiding in plain sight. One thread claimed a previous employee had gone missing 5 years before. Another user pointed to a spike in regional disappearances in the early 2000s, suggesting a long-standing pattern. None of it was ever verified, but the speculation never stopped. Caleb's parents lived through all of it. His mother, Angela, kept flyers in her glove compartment and replaced the ones at the local grocery store every month, even when they were torn down within days. His father, Darren, went back to the property every Halloween night, not to protest, not to make a scene. He just stood near the fence, sometimes for hours, watching the building glow with flickering lights and screams from the inside. He said it wasn't about looking for Caleb anymore. It was about not letting that place pretend he never existed. 3 years in, the haunted house stopped using the asylum theme entirely. Management said it was a branding shift, but internally, they admitted that too many guests kept asking about the kid who went missing. Too many groups refused to enter that final hallway. Some turned back. Some claimed to hear a name whispered from the walls. The legend was growing faster than the story could be controlled. 5 years after Caleb vanished, the case was formally closed. No new evidence, no suspects, no confirmed sightings. The final entry in the file was cold and bureaucratic. Subject presumed deceased. Cause unknown. No further investigative leads. The detective who signed it had been newly assigned. He hadn't worked the original case. He didn't know the wall that once held Caleb's blood, or the guests who described a man no one else could place, or the map that never explained how someone disappeared in front of a crowd. To Caleb's family, the closure wasn't an answer. It was an admission of exhaustion, of limits, a quiet retreat from a case that had become too strange to explain and too empty to chase. But for them, giving up was never on the table. Angela joined online communities for parents of missing children. She attended meetings, sometimes out of state, and talked to other mothers who used the same phrase over and over again. He's just not here. She described the feeling of walking into a room and knowing it wasn't just empty, but missing something. Not absent. Stolen. Darren took a different path. He kept calling the station once a month just to ask if they'd rechecked the footage. He hired a private investigator for almost a year until the money ran out. He mapped the original building layout on graph paper and carried it folded in his coat pocket. At one point, he considered breaking into the building at night just to knock on every wall again, just to listen. By the 7th year, the case had become a ghost, mentioned in passing, whispered among new employees who didn't know the full story. Guests occasionally asked about the missing kid thing, but fewer remembered the name. The forums stayed active, but even they began repeating the same theories. No new clues, no new evidence, no second bloodstain. Just the old silence growing deeper. The haunted house expanded that year, added a new wing with a different exit route. No one noticed that it removed the section where Caleb was last seen, not until it was already done. Angela went to the local board and asked why there hadn't been a public notice before construction. They told her it wasn't a structural change, just interior remodeling. She stood outside the fence that Halloween for the first time without Darren, who had stopped coming. But what she didn't know, and what no one had told the family, was that during the building inspection filed ahead of the expansion, the fire marshal had flagged something. A small off-spec measurement in the blueprint, a wall that extended slightly farther than the plans allowed, 11 feet unaccounted for, no door, no vent, just space. It was dismissed, logged as a likely design inconsistency, never followed up. And for the 8th Halloween in a row, the screams inside the haunted house went on. But outside, beneath the blinking lights and the fresh coat of paint, something was still waiting, hidden, quiet, and sealed. The haunted house shut down for good in late 2024. Officially, the owners blamed rising insurance premiums and seasonal revenue loss. Unofficially, it had become too hard to sell tickets to a building known more for a boy who disappeared than for scares. Over the years, rumors had clung to the walls like mold, stories about sealed basements, missing footage, voices in the dark. But without a body, without proof, nothing ever stuck. By the time the fire marshal arrived in spring 2025 to inspect the structure for demolition permits, the building had been dark for months. Lights off, power disconnected. Only wind moved through the broken signage and boarded windows. The inspection was supposed to be routine, a structural walkthrough to ensure no hazardous materials were present. The building had changed owners twice, and original plans were inconsistent, with hand-drawn addendums, permits missing dates, rooms mislabeled. That alone wasn't surprising. It was an old textile warehouse converted without modern compliance. But what caught the marshal's attention was a minor anomaly on the original floor blueprint. The west interior wall of what had once been the asylum room didn't match the physical structure. According to the plans, the wall should have been flush with the exterior foundation. But when measured, it extended 11 feet farther than it should have. A box-shaped space with no marked entry point. At first, it was assumed to be a sealed storage cavity, maybe a maintenance crawl or leftover insulation bay. But what made it strange was how clean the dimensions were. Symmetrical, reinforced from all visible sides. There was no venting, no light access, and no door. Not even a sealed one. Just a stretch of smooth drywall painted over to blend into the asylum room's theme. Years of repainting and blacklight grime had erased any trace of its separation. It wasn't on any evacuation map. No staff had ever listed it in work logs. No emergency responder had flagged it in prior sweeps. 3 days later, a demolition team returned with permission to breach the wall. The process took less than an hour. A few cuts through drywall, some heavy crowbar work. What they found was not storage. It was a room, fully enclosed, 9 feet wide, 11 feet long, 8 feet high, no windows, no insulation, no fire suppression. The walls were lined with steel paneling beneath a thick layer of sound-dampening foam. The door, if it had ever existed, was on the outside. From inside, there was no handle, no mechanism to exit, only 4 metal bolts that locked inward from the hallway they'd just come through. And in the center of the room was a chair, just a metal folding chair, rusted at the hinges, positioned squarely in the center. The floor beneath it was stained, dark and uneven, as if water or something thicker had pooled and dried over time. In the far corner, there was a plastic water jug with mold growing around its rim. A broken flashlight lay nearby. The air was dry and still. It felt more like a bunker than a room, as if whoever had been in there was never meant to leave. And then someone noticed the camera. Mounted on the ceiling was a motion-activated surveillance camera. It had been painted black to match the overhead beams. A wire snaked into the wall but didn't connect to the building's electrical grid. It ran to a battery pack, long since dead, and a small plastic container screwed to the ceiling above. Inside the container were 10 micro SD cards. None were labeled. For a moment, the team froze. No one touched anything. A call was made to the local sheriff's department, then to the state bureau. Within 6 hours, the building was under lockdown. Forensics arrived the next morning. They wore respirators, latex, gloves, boot covers. They photographed every inch. Blacklight tested the walls. Swabs were taken from the floor, the chair, the water jug. One of the investigators found something wedged beneath the chair leg, what looked like a scrap of canvas, possibly torn clothing. The blood samples were rushed to the lab. That night, no one said it out loud. But everyone who had walked into that room knew what they had just found. Not a prank, not a leftover set piece, a sealed, reinforced chamber with one way in and no way out, in a building where a 17-year-old had entered a room and never exited. By the end of the week, lab results came back. The blood on the floor was human. It matched the DNA profile of Caleb Rains. Authorities now had what they never had before, physical proof that Caleb had been confined, injured, hidden. It reframed everything, the rumors, the blind spots, the man in the straitjacket, the blood behind the foam wall. This wasn't a disappearance, it was entrapment. Still, questions outnumbered answers. How had no one heard him? Why was the room never found in the original search? Who built it, and who had access to it? The SD cards were sent to a digital forensics lab for recovery. Most were corrupted or incomplete, but one card held power. One card had footage, and what it showed would change the case forever. The SD cards were delivered to the state forensics lab under sealed chain of custody. Of the 12 recovered from the hidden chamber, 7 were unreadable. 2 were empty. 2 more contained static and electrical artifacts, likely the result of degraded batteries or impact damage. Only 1 card held viewable footage. Dated October 31st, 2017. Time-stamped 9:19 p.m., the night Caleb Rains disappeared. The footage was black and white, grainy. A fixed overhead shot angled toward the center of the room. The single metal chair was visible, as was a portion of the back wall. No time overlay, no sound. Just flickering grayscale video captured in complete silence. And yet, when investigators watched it for the first time, they sat motionless for nearly 6 minutes before saying anything. Because what they were seeing wasn't just evidence. It was him. Caleb, sitting in the chair, alive. He's hunched forward, elbows on knees, head in his hands. His white costume coat is streaked with what looks like dirt, or possibly blood. He doesn't move much in the beginning. He seems confused, slow, breathing heavily. The timestamp suggests the footage begins just minutes after he entered the asylum room upstairs. In the first hour, he tries to stand. He drifts out of frame, then returns, rubbing his arms like he's cold. He appears to be talking, but there's no sound. He gestures toward the wall, looks up at the camera, then backs away from it, keeping his eyes fixed on the lens. At one point, he mouths something. The frame rate is too low to read his lips clearly, but investigators believe he's saying a name. At hour 3, he slumps in the corner and doesn't move for nearly 15 minutes. Then suddenly, he springs up and begins pounding on the wall. It goes on for 5 minutes, pacing, shouting, kicking, throwing his weight against the seam, but no one responds. He eventually returns to the chair. From that point forward, he stops looking at the camera entirely. By the end of the first day, Caleb is visibly dehydrated. He tries to open the water jug, finds it empty, throws it across the room. The footage skips intermittently, likely due to motion activation limits or corrupted storage. On the second day, his energy is diminished. He crawls at one point, tries to wedge something under the door, possibly a shirt or part of the foam lining. At hour 39, he sits completely still for nearly an hour. And then, at hour 47, minute 12, he stands up, moves to the back corner of the room, and vanishes from frame. He never reappears. Investigators rewatch the moment over and over. The time lapse is uninterrupted. There is no cut, no glitch. 1 second, Caleb is there. The next, he's gone, out of view, and he never returns. Search teams swept the room again. They measured every seam, every corner, every elevation. There were no trap doors, no loose panels. The steel plating beneath the foam was bolted from the outside. Nothing had been disturbed. Lab analysis dated the blood on the wall to the same time frame as the footage, early November 2017. Trace samples found on the shirt fragment also matched Caleb's DNA. But there were other traces too. Skin cells, likely from an adult male, still unidentified. The working theory was that someone had access to the room through the sealed entry wall, but no one had discovered how. The bolts were old but intact. There was no record of additional entry. And the most chilling part, Caleb was last seen alive, not struggling or screaming, but calm, staring into the dark. When the video was shown to Caleb's parents, they asked only one question. Why did no one hear him? Why didn't anyone come? And the only answer law enforcement could give was silence. The room was soundproofed, intentionally. The foam wasn't leftover prop material. It had been glued in place to absorb noise. The walls were double-lined with insulation. No sound would have escaped, not to the hallway, not even to the floor above. One of the detectives on the case, now retired, said he had trouble sleeping for weeks after viewing the tape, not because of what was shown, but because of what wasn't. He was alive, the man said, for almost 2 days. In a building full of people, forensic technicians tried enhancing the audio, extracting latent sound from the card's corrupted channels. All they recovered were faint background noises, electrical hum, movement near the camera, and one short, indecipherable tone at hour 32, a single, high-pitched click like a device being turned on, or off. Digital experts reviewed the footage for signs of tampering. None were found. It was authentic, uncut. The lighting matched known electrical signatures from the building's backup generator, which had been powered down 2 days later during the initial investigation. All timelines aligned. Caleb had been alive for nearly 48 hours inside that room. Then, he disappeared without sound, struggle, or exit. What disturbed the investigators most was the emotion on his face in those final hours. Not panic, not anger, something else. Resignation. Like he knew no one was coming. Like he'd given up. When the final frame played, an empty room, the chair slightly turned, the water jug tipped over. There was nothing left to see. Just a boy who was there, and then wasn't. No one knew who brought him in. No one knew who let him out. But someone had been there with him, and someone had taken the rest of the truth with them. After the footage of Caleb surfaced, a specialized forensic audio team was brought in to analyze every second. Although the video had no built-in microphone, trace audio, residual vibrations caught by the camera's internal processor, remained embedded in the corrupted file data. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. Over the course of 2 weeks, technicians from the state lab, assisted by private analysts from a federal missing persons task force, ran multi-layered frequency extractions on the SD card. What they discovered wasn't speech at first. It was rhythm. The first recovered sounds were soft, repetitive thuds, spaced apart unevenly but too structured to be random. Footsteps from above, then a shift, something heavier, a dragging sound, metal on wood, or maybe something pulled across concrete. The pitch analysis ruled out known haunted house effects. These weren't part of the scare programming. The audio signature didn't match any known loops, ambient tracks, or speaker feeds from the archived haunted house files. They were too distant, too organic, real. In one segment, occurring roughly 14 hours into the recording, Caleb's second night inside the chamber, the analysis picked up something different. A low murmur, barely audible, slurred, breathy, a sound that hadn't been noticed in the raw footage. When slowed down and cleaned, it revealed what the forensic linguist described as a phonetic pattern. 3 syllables, consistent with the name Caleb, They ran it again, same cadence, same breath. The voice was adult, male, unidentifiable. There was no match in the haunted house employee database. No actor recalled saying anything near the back hallway that night. And most important, no one had ever been aware that a hidden room existed below that corridor. It wasn't on any blueprints. No one admitted to using it. And yet, someone had walked directly above that ceiling. Someone had whispered Caleb's name. Investigators shifted focus to the wiring. The building's original electrical grid had been modified multiple times over the years, first in the early 90s, again in 2008, and then piecemeal by various haunted house operators. It was a maze of rerouted power, extension cords, hidden outlets, breakers labeled in marker. But when electricians traced the circuits connected to the back hallway, they found something disturbing: a tamper bypass. Behind the foam panel adjacent to the hidden chamber wall, a secondary power switch had been installed. Small, crude, meant to divert current around the main grid. Whoever had installed it had cut into the conduit and bridged the connection using a battery relay. That meant they could turn off power to that section, specifically to the lights, cameras, and alarms, without triggering the emergency system. That switch had been in place for years. When investigators checked the work orders, no licensed electrician had logged any such alteration. It was undocumented, unauthorized, and it had likely been used the night Caleb disappeared. So the question became, who had access? Records showed that only 3 people had keys to the rear maintenance hallway that year: 2 managers and a contracted set designer. Both managers were interviewed again. One was no longer in the state. The other, Jason Evers, still lived nearby. At the time of Caleb's disappearance, Evers had overseen the haunted house's day-to-day operations. He handled scheduling, prop installations, and maintenance. He claimed to have no knowledge of the hidden chamber, said he'd never heard of any bypass wiring, that he was shocked by everything found. But inconsistencies emerged. He'd told investigators in 2017 that he had gone home early on Halloween night before the final walkthrough. Yet 2 witnesses, both teenage employees, said they saw him near the back hallway close to closing time. One described him as agitated. The other remembered him standing alone by the foam wall, staring. They were dismissed at the time. No one followed up. Evers had no criminal history, no prior complaints. But he'd also worked at 3 other haunted attractions over the previous decade, 2 of which had since closed. One of those locations had reportedly suffered a break-in during off-season repairs, but no incident report had been filed. When questioned about this, Evers said it was a misunderstanding, just kids vandalizing the property. He denied any connection. No formal charges were ever brought. But the wiring told a different story. The battery switch was old, predating Caleb's disappearance by at least a year. Whoever installed it had planned ahead. That room, sealed and soundproofed, wasn't a last-minute hiding spot. It had been prepared, purpose-built, and used only once. Investigators began building a profile. It had to be someone with unrestricted access to the building, someone who understood the electrical system well enough to install a bypass undetected, someone familiar with staff, patterns, blind spots, and escape routes, someone who wouldn't stand out, someone who belonged. The forensic architecture team returned to scan the space again. This time, they focused on overhead structural voids. One result stood out. A shallow duct channel, sealed at both ends, ran above the hidden chamber, just wide enough for a person to crawl through, if they knew the way, if they had the time. The footage showed Caleb looking up multiple times, toward the sound, toward the voice. And when he vanished from frame, he moved in that direction. Investigators now believed that whoever had built the chamber didn't just watch Caleb. They returned. Maybe once, maybe more. There were no signs of forced entry, but the overhead duct could have provided temporary access. A way in, a way out. Still, no fingerprints were recovered. The chamber had been wiped long ago. Only degraded skin oils remained, DNA fragments too faint to match. Whoever was responsible had planned it meticulously and executed it cleanly. But then came something unexpected. A retired fire inspector, reviewing the case through a public request for comment, reached out to authorities. He had been involved in the initial 2008 code evaluation of the building during its first year as a haunted attraction. And he remembered something. A concern raised during early inspections about unpermitted construction in the West Corridor. At the time, it was dismissed as cosmetic remodeling, but he recalled writing up a note about suspicious reinforcement in one wall. The complaint was never followed up. That wall, it turned out, was the same one that later hid the chamber. This wasn't an improvisation. It had been developing for years. By now, the theory had changed. Caleb hadn't simply been abducted. He'd been studied. Someone watched the haunted house evolve, saw how dark it got, how chaotic, how anonymous. They waited for the right moment, then used it. The whispers in the footage weren't the only clue. In the final hours of recovered audio, just before Caleb disappeared from view, one last sound emerged. A slow, dragging noise, then silence, then a thud, not overhead but inside the room. Experts still debate what it was: a dropped object, a closing vent, a person entering or leaving. But whatever it was, it marked the end. Because after that moment, Caleb was gone. No footsteps, no return. Just a chair turned slightly to the left, and a room that went quiet again for 8 more years. What they now knew was chilling. Caleb hadn't died in an instant. He'd waited, listened, and someone had been walking above him, watching, whispering, close enough to touch the ceiling. And still, even now, no one had come forward. No one confessed, because whoever had built that room had always planned to leave nothing behind. Except the silence. 2 weeks after the hidden room was breached and Caleb's footage made national headlines, a man in his late 60s walked into the regional sheriff's office and asked to speak with someone about the haunted house. He didn't bring a lawyer. He wasn't on any suspect list. He wasn't even listed in the original employee files. His name was Edward Massey, and he'd worked as a temporary custodian during the 2017 Halloween season. Cash only. No paperwork. Hired by word of mouth through a former employee who couldn't remember his last name. Massey had seen the footage. He'd watched the press conference with Caleb's parents, and he couldn't let go of something he hadn't thought about in years. A small moment, easy to dismiss back then. But not now. He said it happened a few days before Halloween. He'd come in early that night, just after 5 p.m., to clean the back hallway near the asylum room. One of the foam panels had been damaged during rehearsal the night before. Props were scattered, buckets of fake blood still open. Massey was moving supplies when he noticed something strange in the bottom of his mop bucket, something he hadn't put there. A ring of 3 brass keys, each worn and unlabeled. They weren't attached to the main staff set, which hung on a hook by the break room. These had no tag, no lanyard, just old keys clipped together by a bent metal loop. He assumed someone dropped them, maybe maintenance, maybe another cleaner. Out of habit, he pocketed them, thinking he'd turn them in later. But when he passed the back of the asylum room, something made him stop. One of the wall panels, the one near the false oxygen tanks, had a hairline crack. He'd never noticed it before. He tried one of the keys. It turned. Behind the wall was a metal door, no sign, no handle on the outside, just a single lock. It opened into a narrow hallway, unlit, musty, and lined with unfinished drywall. At the end was another door, this one half covered by a draped black curtain and marked with a red X. Massey didn't go inside. The air smelled wrong. Not just musty, dead. He assumed it was for prop storage or some new scare feature. The place was full of weird corridors. He backed out, locked the door again, and never mentioned it. What caught detectives off guard wasn't just the story, it was the location. Massey had no way of knowing where the hidden room had been discovered. Yet his description of the wall, the panel, the position of the oxygen tanks, it all matched perfectly. He'd unlocked it 3 nights before Caleb vanished. When investigators asked if he still had the keys, he shook his head. He'd thrown them out with a pair of broken work shoes at the end of the season. But he remembered the shape, the weight. One key had a triangle cutout, another had a rounded bow. The third was short, stubby like a locker key. Detectives rescanned the original inventory. No such keys were logged. No documentation existed for any internal doors behind the asylum room. That area wasn't supposed to have storage. And Massey, hired off the books, had never been asked to clean back there again. A new theory began forming. It wasn't just that Caleb had been taken. It was that the person responsible had created a controlled, isolated space, hidden in plain sight, and manipulated the building around it. Someone with access to backdoor keys, someone who knew the schedule, knew when cameras were on or off, someone who could leave no trace because they were part of the furniture. Invisible, maintenance, set crew, custodial. People who were expected to move unseen. They started rechecking old rosters, looking deeper at vendors. One name popped up, a private contractor listed in a 2015 maintenance report. The invoice was vague. Electrical and drywall consultation, but the signature belonged to a man named Joseph Loring. No photo ID, no address on file, just a cell number that had long since been disconnected. That name had never come up before. Loring had not worked during the 2017 season, but archived emails showed that the haunted house owners had consulted him during early remodeling. He'd been recommended by someone who had worked there briefly during the same year Massey had found the keys. The problem was, Loring didn't exist. The name wasn't tied to any contractor license in the state. No utility bills, no tax filings. It was likely an alias. When investigators looked further, they found something chilling. In 2011, another haunted house in upstate New York reported a suspicious break-in during their off-season. Nothing was stolen. But a storage closet had been broken open and a section of wall was partially removed. The structure had since been demolished. No arrests were made. And the man they'd hired for drywall that season had used a similar name, J. Loring. Detectives now believed they were dealing with someone who had done this before. Someone who scoped out buildings with complex interiors. Someone who didn't act impulsively, but designed spaces in advance. Then, something else happened. Less than 2 weeks after Massey gave his statement, the sheriff's office requested to review the original SD cards collected from the hidden chamber. But when the evidence technician opened the secure drawer, 2 items were missing. 1, the unused SD cards from the plastic box, including 2 that had been too damaged to read. 2, the auxiliary key recovered during the inspection, a backup copy of the one used to unlock the sealed wall. The drawer had not been forced open, no break-in, no breach. But the chain of custody had one unexplained signature, initialed by a junior evidence clerk who claimed he never made the entry. His badge number had been logged, but the handwriting didn't match his. Surveillance footage for that wing of the evidence room was wiped due to a server update 2 days earlier. There was no way to prove who had accessed the drawer, no way to know how they got in, and no way to know what had been on the corrupted cards. For Caleb's family, it was another loss, another piece of the truth taken before they could see it. But for investigators, it confirmed what they already feared. Someone was still watching, someone who had kept their secret for 8 years and now knew it was unraveling. A bulletin was issued statewide. The case was reopened, now classified as an active criminal investigation. Digital sketches of the J. Loring alias were released to agencies across state lines. A new hotline was launched, but as of today, no verified sightings have been reported. The key remains missing. So do the cards. But one thing is now certain, Caleb didn't walk into that room by accident. Someone built it, someone had keys, and someone went back to silence what was left. Not all monsters hide behind masks. Some carry mops, some install drywall, and some make sure the locks can only turn one way. Weeks after the discovery, as forensic teams prepared to finalize their sweep of the hidden room, one technician noticed a small discoloration beneath the rusted chair. The floor had already been documented, swabbed, dusted. But under the back leg, scratched faintly into the concrete, was something no one had seen. 2 lines etched with a blunt metal object, likely the broken edge of the flashlight found nearby. The first line read, "Not alone." The second was smaller, etched more shakily, as if the writer had hesitated before finishing. He wore the mask too long. He forgot who he was. There were no initials, no date, just those two lines, deliberate, shallow, and buried beneath years of dust and silence. Investigators believe the messages were scratched sometime during Caleb's second day in the room, a final effort to say something no one would hear. His body was never found. The duct above showed signs of later tampering, but the trail went cold. Whoever accessed the room after Caleb vanished, whoever returned for the SD cards, the key, was never identified. No fingerprints, no DNA match, no arrest. The room was sealed again. A metal plate was welded over the door, the bolts driven deeper into the concrete. The building was condemned, but never demolished. It still stands, empty. And every Halloween, just after sunset, someone places a single candle on the ground outside the wall that once hid the chamber. No name, no note. Just a small flame burning into the dark. Some believe it's Caleb's mother. Others think it's the man who built the room. But no one has ever been seen lighting it, and no one has ever stayed long enough to watch it burn out.